Then there's the siren song of disclosure. It's so easy in a situation where you have problems with information to say we should have more disclosure. But when you go out and buy a smartphone, you don't do due diligence on it. You basically decide whether it's an Apple or an HTC, or it comes from someone with a reputation that you know and like. And John Kay makes that point in that particular quote. John Kay's terrific, by the way, if you get a chance to read any of his articles or books. Writes for the Financial Times in London. So we could make our lives a lot better by focusing interventions not so much on this idea that every consumer is going to turn up as Sherlock Holmes and work it all out, but by trying to get information out there that governs the reputations around which we make decisions. So, for instance, workers' compensation premiums are a good proxy for occupational health and safety performance. Why don't we get them out there so that prospective employees know those things when they go and work for someone? I took a proposal to the 2020 summit, and I won't go into it in detail, but it was a way that we might be able to get firms to voluntarily declare the results they get from employee satisfaction surveys, essentially because they're trying to compete for employees. I think that would be a terrific thing because there are lots of correlations between satisfied workers and productive workers. And it's odd in a time when we have periodic civil wars about deregulating the labour market, freeing up the labour market, that we free up the labour market without attending to this incredible fact that most people, when they go to a job, don't really quite know what it's going to be like and whether that workplace that they go to has a good reputation for giving people what they rate as either the most important or second most important thing about their job, which is how satisfied they're going to be, how valued and productive they're likely to feel. Some good ideas came in with the Rudd government, and then went out with the Rudd government, sadly, and it was a pity that we didn't. It was a pity that we didn't persevere with things like Grocery Watch and Fuel Watch, and it's quite likely that the way they were initially conceived was thoroughly flawed. That doesn't mean that we couldn't be trying to work out ways of getting better information out. My school website is again fairly simple, fairly simplistic in some ways, but I think a very good thing to be trying to do and a good model to try to work on. And I've done a lot of work in the area of Government 2.0, that is the use of Web 2 tools by government, and in particular we now have a much more powerful idea of the power of public sector information, the information that governments spend a lot of money generating, and we are now trying to move to a situation where it is released by default rather than under the FOI system or the past FOI system where you had to go and kind of beg for it. But it will not be an easy thing. There is still a great deal of discretion, and it's just not clear how far we can take the model. So that's something that we should be looking at. On the question of risk, our approaches to government risk, I think, are pretty primitive. We basically manage government balance sheets by default, not by design. That's how much is government borrowing? Well, it's basically whatever they need. That is not how. What I mean by that is they look at they spend money, they get revenue in, and the rest they borrow. Now that isn't the way BHP or any self-respecting private sector organisation would manage their balance sheet. They would ask how much risk they can take on, what the returns are for the how they can invest money, and the amount they borrow would be the result of that. Another point I'd make is that privatisation of lots of assets in the 90s and the 2000s has certainly, I think, in most cases improved incentives, although we did tend to privatise some tricky assets. But it's also worsened risk-bearing. The government, because of its capacity to pool risks, is one of the lowest cost bearers of risk, and you can see that in the cost of bonds as opposed to the cost of private sector borrowing, or the interest rate on bonds. And we don't think about that, or we use that, although we are now, again, almost by default, starting to think about that, at least in terms of things like the future fund. Why we don't borrow to have a larger future fund is a little beyond me, given that it would increase our risk. Only a small amount to government would reduce risk by more in the private sector and would increase returns for governments. So I'll move on. We've heard about the Sydney Cross Sydney Tunnel, the Cross Sydney Tunnel, I'll move on. I was quite intrigued by the first version of the resource rent tax, which everyone sort of greeted with incomprehension. But just to explain, because I think there will be quite a lot of people in this room who do not understand, because the media didn't explain it, what the original resource rent tax was. But basically, what happened was that the tax system was used to enable the government to be a 40% joint venture partner, a silent partner with a resource company. That meant that every dollar that they invested, they got 40% back as a government contribution to start off with, and then the government got 40% of the profits back. So that's where this idea of it being sort of nice and neat and elegant came from. One of the things that's interesting about that is that involves the government as a risk bearer, which makes a lot of sense because the government is capable of bearing a large amount of risk. But what did we do? We tried to push that upfront payment off the balance sheet of the government and push it onto the balance sheet of the corporates. And that was where the long-term bond rate came from, when we all had this argument about whether super profits were, we needed an uplift factor for whether super profits should be, say, above 12% or something like that. That was a completely bogus argument, misunderstanding the way the tax was designed. The point I'm trying to make is that we did something really quite elegant and clever, and then we said, oh, well, we don't want to take any of we're the government, we don't want to take any of the risk. A crazy idea, it seems to me. There's a large risk management agenda sketched out by Schiller, a whole lot of instruments that we could try to help develop, and governments have shown virtually, very little interest in those things, and yet governments would be able to do quite a lot there.